Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. And we are meeting here today on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. My name is Julie Hare and I'm the club director, not the club director, and education editor at the Australian Financial Review. Welcome today. Our guest today is Professor Bruce Chapman, an Emeritus Professor of Economics at Australian National University, and that is an understatement. His speech today is entitled HECS Isn't Broken, but it needs urgent attention. Bruce is often described as the architect of HECS. I don't know where this word architect came from, but pretty well 9 out of every 10 stories that you'll read about that mention HECS, Bruce will be described as the architect. I don't know whether that makes him feel good or just a little bit weird, like a builder. As we know, HECS was introduced in the late 1980s. It was a piece of policy genius as a way for allowing the Hawke government to massify the number of people going to university from elite, less than 10% of the population, to massive. As at the moment we're over 40%, heading up to 45%. At the same time, it required those people who benefited from that education to contribute to it. But the absolute genius of it was that those that didn't benefit from their education, and there were always some, didn't have to repay their debt until they started earning a certain amount of income. Anyway, like superannuation, over the years, various governments have felt that really good, perfect policy needs to be fiddled with to fix whatever agendas or ideological issues that they of the day. HECS has been fiddled with a lot in recent years, and increasingly this year it has become very much a focal point. This happens at the same time that we have had student debt reach record levels and is actually now, for the first time ever, becoming a problem in that it's interfering with people, graduates' future lives. However, last Thursday, the Parliament passed legislation to wipe $3 billion of student debt for more than 3 million Australians and will cost the federal budget more than $500 million. This legislation also fixes the way indexation is calculated on student debt, and will be backdated to the 1st of June 2023. Indexation became a major problem, probably the first time since HECS was introduced, when it spiked to 7.1% in 2023. It's now about 3%. Obviously, it is a hot election issue, especially among young voters, as the Greens and Labor go hunting for inner city professionals who they want to vote for them. I would like you to welcome Bruce Chapman. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to the National Press Club for inviting me. I feel very privileged to be here. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area, and pay respect to the elders past and present of Australian Indigenous peoples. I wish to express my thanks to my friends Paul Girawa House and Chris Andrew for helping me to understand the meaning and financial implications of Australian racism and dispossession, which has resulted in major inequalities of wealth and continuing lack of access to economic privilege for Indigenous peoples. Thank you for coming, Chris. As background, I want to talk about the policy issue of so-called free higher education. It's a big topic because of the advocacy of an Australian political party for universities to be free. I use the word in inverted commas. Let's ask, what does this mean? For economists, there is no such thing as free higher education, or indeed free anything. If higher education services magically dropped out of the sky, then who could be against this? It would be great if it could also be free food, free housing, free love, free willy, free everything. And if free was everywhere, there would be no need for economists hanging around with our miserable and dour insistence that there are trade-offs to be made with all public policy decisions. A world without economists, how good would that be? We'd be sorry to leave you, but you may not be sorry to see us go. Sadly, this is fantasy. Universities use resources that could produce other things, so universities can't be free. What free means with public universities, and this is really the big point, is for there to be no charge for students or graduates. This then must mean it is financed by all taxpayers. And the equity issue is this. Most taxpayers, even now, are not university graduates. 65% of Australian adults are not university graduates, and they earn much less over their lifetimes than graduates, around 1.5 million less on average. So free to students and graduates means greater tax payments from or less services to the less advantaged. This is about as inequitable as policy could be. It would markedly help the advantaged and make the less advantaged worse off. Also, and a more extraordinary recent development is that it has also been suggested to cancel the $80 billion of unpaid HECS debt. This is the same as giving the average graduate debtor about $27,600. This is about as regressive as policy can get. And let's ask this question. What could we buy with the $80 billion? Well, I'll give you a few examples. $80 billion will get you 40 years of the single parenting payment being restored to what it was at its maximum of a few years ago, or an annual grant of $10,000 for 200,000 victims of domestic violence for 40 years, or an increase in the job seeker payments of $2,000 per annum for 500,000 unemployed people for 80 years, or almost a year of the total cost of running all Australian hospitals. I hope this discussion about so-called free higher education stops or becomes more sensible soon, and that the word free is not used as if it is meaningful and substantive. On the more important aspect of my story, the talk is entitled, in part, HECS is not broken. Let me try and explain why. Let me try and describe the aspects of HECS that make it a good financing system, and I'll do that not just in conceptual terms, but with reference to other countries. So let's begin with a question. Why do we have HECS? The answer is that the Hawke government wanted to substantially expand university places, but it was not prepared to finance this without a contribution from graduates. This was a government that was parsimonious with respect to its fiscal position. It did not want to be seen, as previous Labor governments had been seen, as high tax, as high spend. It was critical that if the system was to get bigger, there was a contribution from graduates. And this was the motivation for the reintroduction of charges, which were abolished in 1974. I'd be very happy to address the fee abolition in the Q&A. The issue for John Dawkins, the minister in 1988, was the following. How do we achieve a fee system when many can't afford to pay that? Why won't the banks help? And the critical point about the banks is that higher education investments are risky. About 25% of people enrol in undergraduate degrees do not complete. I mean, they don't complete at all, not just they don't complete in their area. But the big problem for a bank is in the event of default, unlike a house, there's no collateral, there's nothing to sell. It's a very risky proposition for a bank. With a mortgage default, a bank can sell your house, but with a student loan default, a bank can't sell your brain. There's no market for brains. So government intervention is needed in the form of loans. This happens in every country in the world. But there are different types of loans. The most commonplace loan, still easily the most commonplace loan, is called a time-based repayment loan, or TBRL. It's in most countries, the United States, Canada, most of Asia, South America. How do these loans work? Think of your mortgage, a set obligation to pay a particular amount, usually every month, for a set period of time. In the US, for example, it's 10 years. The other type of loan is called an income contingent loan. That's HECS. It's now in Australia, it's in England, it's in New Zealand, it's in Hungary, it's in South Korea, and there are other countries getting very close to the full adoption of this system. The critical point about HECS is repayment. It's based on capacity to repay. If you don't have the money in a particular period, you don't pay. If you're unemployed, you don't pay. If you're looking after an infant, you don't pay. If you're caring for an aged parent, you don't pay. You can pay later, but you can have extensive periods of non-payment, and that actually happens for a lot of people. So the key concept with income contingent loan is the word insurance. There's insurance against repayment difficulties. There's insurance against loan default. There's insurance against anxiety about having to repay in the future if you think you may not have the money. TBRL can't achieve any of this. Empirical work involving more than 20 international scholars in all countries with TBRL shows something quite extraordinary. If you look at graduate incomes and you take the bottom 20% of the incomes of all graduates in these countries, paying back their TBLs, like in the United States or Colombia or Thailand, if they're in the bottom 20% of the earnings of graduates, they require every month to use 100% or more of their incomes to repay the debt. That's an extraordinary figure. When I first saw it, I thought that's kind of the most important bit of data that we need to understand student loan comparisons. What does that mean? Well, for some people, they'll muddle through. They might be able to get loans from parents or friends. They won't be friends for too long if you can't repay them. But if they don't muddle through, they will default. And default is the most serious financial consequence that you can experience. It ruins lives. It ruins your credit reputation. It means no access to loans for a house or a car. Basically, your life financially, and therefore most of it, is ruined if you default on a student loan. And these numbers are big. In many countries, 50% or more. Even in the United States, where the incomes are high, about 20% of people default on their loans. Let's look at the international comparisons here. Let's visit the United States. Currently, there are 15 million people in the United States who have defaulted on their student loans. Their credit reputations are ruined. They won't be able to borrow for a house. They might be able to get their credit reputation back eventually, but it's going to take a while and it'll be a struggle for them. Maybe take you now to Thailand. It's illegal in Thailand not to pay your student loan. Over 1 million people there have broken the law because they were poor, essentially, and they await trial. Let's visit Colombia in South America, where I spent a lot of time. Every time I go to Colombia, I go down to the office of the student loans called HECS, because I'm kind of curious to see what's happening, and what's happening there is always happening. It's always the same. Even if you go very early, there are hundreds of people lined up to plead with officials for loan forgiveness because they don't have the money. So this is not because they're cheats or they're avoiding the system in some fancy way. It's because they're poor. And one of the reasons that this happens a lot in Colombia is that the default rates for student loans are so high. What happens here if you don't have the money? Or in New Zealand or England? When you don't have the money with HECS, what happens is nothing. There's no problem, there's no issue. You're not chased, there is no default, there's no credit reputation loss. And speaking of uncertainty, what happened during the pandemic? This is something I don't think any of us thought about, was the whole concept of what I'll call cohort risk. Is there something that might affect an entire cohort of new graduates that no one ever anticipated, which would lock them out of employment for a short period? And it turned up. It's called COVID. Nobody understood this. At least, certainly I had no idea that you could have protection from HECS because of income contingent repayment. And so in other countries, there was chaos. The graduate labour markets were dysfunctional all over the world for a short period of time. And it led Joe Biden's administration to forgive literally hundreds of billions of dollars of student loans because the graduates didn't have, the young graduates, the new graduates, didn't have employment. I met a young woman who's just graduated from an Australian university. At the time of lockdown, she was looking for a job, she didn't have it. I said, what are you going to do about your HECS debt? which was a bit cruel of me, really. And she said, "Oh my God, do I have to do something? Do I have to pay it? I haven't got any money." I said, "No, you don't have to do anything. Just ignore it. It's like the current account deficit. If you don't look at it, it doesn't matter at all." So the insurance issue is critical as to why I think HECS is a good instrument. No repayment problems if it's designed properly, and I'll get onto that. There's no law breaking involved, as in Thailand. There are no defaults. There are no ruined lives. The HECS public debate has always been about having tuition charges and how much they should be. I don't think this is a big issue. The case for tuition is strong so long as you don't stop poor people from coming, and tuition charges are everywhere. The big issue in terms of HECS is collection design, and this is where insurance comes in, and that's why income contingent loans are important. So the essence of the income contingent loan system should not be in doubt in concept terms and in practice terms. From the graduate's perspective and also from the government's perspective, what happens in other countries when governments default students out of loans or graduates out of loans is that they don't get any more money. So what happens in Australia or England or New Zealand is if you don't have the money in a particular period of time, that's okay. They'll kind of get you later, but only if your income is high. And what that means is because we don't have default aspects to HECS, people who go periods, perhaps from looking after young children, without paying, they can pay later. The revenue streams we've calculated will always be greater under a contingent debt system than a normal debt system because you don't cut off the repayments once there is the experience of default. I'm now on to the contemporary relevance of the talk, which is why HECS needs urgent attention. But before this economist indulges in the misery of our craft, which I do a lot of, and I'm not alone, I would like to say something very positive about recent HECS policy. Over 35 years since HECS came about, governments have been unable to resist changing it, as Julie said. "Oh, we've got nothing to do with this budget. Let's change HECS again. Oh, I'm the new minister. I can make my mark by improving HECS," in their opinion. The single most important feature of an income contingent loan, and there are many aspects of the rules, the most important to me is the first income threshold of repayment. This started out at average earnings in 1989. It has been changed no less than 6 times in real terms, just about always making it lower. So the idea that graduates would start repaying only when they earned the average income, that was lost a very long time ago. The first income threshold of repayment has become much lower and has even reached $48,000 per annum, which is 30% less than it was in 1989. Originally set, as I said, the average incomes. HECS is supposed to protect graduates from repayment hardship, and this increasingly has not been happening. Bless it, the current government has now put in place the lifting of the first income threshold of repayment of HECS from current levels of $54,500 to $67,000 per annum. That sounds pretty much exactly where it was originally at average income of all people working. As well, the government has announced they'll be moving the system to a much fairer collection based on marginal income, like income taxes, rather than total income. It should always have been based on marginal incomes, and I'm partly responsible for that error. I'm not alone, but I'm partly responsible. It's now going to be much better, much smarter on the additional money you earn, not the total. It gets rid of these huge cliff faces, which won't affect the aggregate labour supply situation, but they'll certainly affect individual decisions, particularly part-timers, in ways that were not desirable. I say without reservation that these are the most important improvements of HECS in the last 30 years. In collection, this puts the system back to 1989, and in collection terms, I think that's where it belongs. It's hard to find many things in the world that are truly wonderful these days. Go on, quick, think of something. I bet you can't. But in terms of higher education policy, this is one of them. It means that no annual payments are required until a person's income reaches $67,000 per annum, which is the average. It's the right level based on the conceptual arguments for human capital contracts, which came about all those years ago through the work of Milton Friedman. Low-income graduates will not have to repay in those years, and the distortions introduced by the wrong measure of collection, they've gone. Now, I don't want to get too excited about this, because there is still much to be fixed. But thankfully for this economist, a most important blemish in the system has been corrected. I hope it now becomes a permanent and reliable feature of the system. No more tinkering on the first income threshold, he said, without optimism. I'm now up to the issue of what is broken and how it might be corrected. Problem number one, and to quote Ned, the insurance salesman from Groundhog Day, in his endeavours to avoid stepping into a very deep puddle with this problem, it's a doozy. It goes by the name of the Jobs Ready Graduate Package. Announced in 2020, it became law. It's still with us in 2021. Mark it down, lest we forget. The basic idea behind the Jobs Ready Graduate Package is kind of like this. We need to have the most useful graduates, and in some areas of study, graduates are more productive than in others. An assertion. STEM, for example, is very useful, and humanities is less so. Humanities, by the way, is the most common degree of Australian politicians. The effect of the Jobs Ready package is that it A, doubled the price of all humanities, B, considerably cut the price of STEM courses, C, it took the most advantaged graduates, that is medical specialists, it took them out of the top tier of charges, and D, meant an overall increase in the total debt for new students. So if you're a medical specialist or you're studying to be one, per year you pay less, significantly less, than if you're studying humanities. Your debt will be high because you study for longer, but on a per annual basis, that's the way the system now is. The Jobs Ready Graduate Package, was this a good idea? In a simple word, no. The many problems include the following. It would not make the labour market more efficient, analysed Anne Daly and Phil Lewis from the University of Canberra. Problem 2. It would provide all the wrong incentives for universities, explained best by Richard Holden, University of New South Wales, and understood very quickly by ANU Vice-Chancellor Brian Schmidt, who announced after it came about, we'd have a lot more humanities people now, because so long as they weren't scared by the price increase, the universities were now getting more for humanities and not less, and not more for STEM. And that's exactly what happened. And thirdly, this system would likely have little effect on education or labour market choices because the true price changes of these are tiny. And that's work I did with my colleague, Gaurav Khemka. Thank you for being here. What has Job Ready Graduate Package resulted in? Unfair, unreasonable relative prices, large debts for the lowest income graduates, and thus a profound, in my view, profound sense of social injustice now about the system which was not there before. What it has not resulted in is any changes to education or career choices. This outcome was predicted by economists and for many normal humans as well. I wish to acknowledge that there's a strange new sense of agreement among economists. As economists, we agree on 2 propositions. Number 1, we don't agree on anything. Number 2, tariffs are a very bad idea. But now, at least in Australia, we have a third point of warm bonding and agreement in our club, and that is the economics of the Jobs Ready Graduate Package is seriously in error. What should be done about this, and how should it be done? I'll give you some background about my engagement in this issue, which was with the university's Accord process last year. I was asked to consider the right way to think about HECS prices. Weirdly, I hadn't really done this before. What have I been doing for 35 years? I hear you cry. when I revisited all the pricing, I came to an extraordinary conclusion. Every government, every situation, every policy proposal in this space has been incorrect, including the original arrangements that I helped design. I now think the best way to set HECS prices is through reference to the expected lifetime incomes by course of study, and these are very different. So I'll offer you some examples from work done by Gaurav Kemper and Tim Higgins. The relative median lifetime incomes of people who study various courses compared to the median graduate lifetime income. For law, 44% higher. For engineering, 22% higher. For education, which essentially means teachers, 5% lower. For nurses, 12% lower. For humanities, 10% lower. This is the basis under which all future HECS pricing changes should be based on, and it's the work that Gaurav and Tim have done. They've really started this process very well. In summary on the history, HECS price setting should not, A, be based on costs, as the Rank Committee suggested. They came up with HECS. Should not be uniform, which is what John Dawkins introduced in 1989. Should not be to let universities set their own prices, which came from Christopher Pyne's budget in 2014. I was so pleased the Senate stopped that. Sometimes the Senate was a very annoying institution. I was very, very happy with what happened in 2014. And it is certainly not the current Jobs Ready graduate package. Expected lifetime income is the basis for equity on the charging system. So we've been a long way away from most of the, for most of the last 35 years. The changes introduced in 1998 were pretty good. They were about as close as we've ever been to a reflection of capacity to pay. And those in existence now, as I've said, are about the furthest, as you can imagine, from being fair or sensible. I think that the government gets this, and I think it wants to change relative prices. I'm inferring that from statements from the Minister. I haven't been told. It has been strongly recommended by the University Accord Review. We are waiting for the establishment of the planned Australian Tertiary Education Commission, and I presume this will be a key aspect on its agenda. Thankfully, great research exists to help guide the policy debate now underway. This is from the ANU's College of Business and Economics, Tim Higgins and Gaurav Kemper. What Higgins and Kemper have produced using the 2021 census is a matrix of policy options for price change, with prices based, as I pointed out, on expected lifetime incomes, all costed for the budget in terms of the subsidies related to the interest rates. That's an important aspect of all this, and for what is known as debt not expected to be repaid. Some people never pay back all their HECS. So they have modelled a plethora of possibilities, with lower earnings graduates, which includes those studying humanities and nursing, charge the lower prices, and graduates in the higher earning fields, such as law and medical studies, being charged the highest. The government can complement this with the use of more comprehensive data. Tim and Gaurav use the census. The government knows the data. They've followed people through the tax system for decades. They'll do it more comprehensively, but the conceptual basis and the methodology is there. They could almost go now with what Gaurav and Tim have come up with. In my view, they'll be pretty close to the real data. I commend their rigorous and thoughtful analysis to you. The big steps towards major reform to the Jobs Ready graduate package have now been taken. HECS's basic, biggest problem can be sorted out soon. My second matter of troubling help issues is one that doesn't get a lot of attention because the number of students are low. There's only about 50,000 of them, and this is postgraduate students in the public universities. It is a situation which is so complicated, so Byzantine, I don't get it. There's an arbitrariness about which students are in which area. Some people are in called Commonwealth supported places. They pay what the government has set. Others, about half of them, are in places where the institutions set their own prices. This is a very bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is that HECS is a very potent financial instrument. All the risks are borne by the taxpayer. So an institution, so long as the price responses are small, the institution can charge a very large sum of money. And what does this mean? You can end up, as I think we've got now, is that postgraduate people in the full fee paying area are heavily subsidising research or other activities. Is this a reasonable thing? Do you think students who are paying for their teaching part of their experience at universities should also be covering the costs of research? It's very hard for me to understand that. It's a public good. Public good gets paid for by all taxpayers, not people who are a bit unlucky enough to have found themselves wanting to do postgraduate work with extremely high prices. The facts are pretty amazing, really. While the average increase in debt from HECS with postgraduate is about $28,000 a year, some of the debts are over $100,000. And here's a problem. There's a cap on the amount of debt that people are allowed to have. It's $114,000. So if you go through a pretty expensive course and you do honours and maybe a master's and you want to do one of these courses, you'll be over the cap. How do you pay it? I don't know how you pay it. You can't go to the bank for the reasons I outlined. You have to find the cash. This is totally in contradistinction to what HECS was all about. HECS was motivated to take away the upfront financial costs of participation in the system. There are people, I don't know how big that number is, it's hard to work it out. It could be as many as 20,000 who are paying some part of the postgraduate fee because they've exceeded the cap. I'm guessing that, but the number is not trivial. The system really needs a lot of looking at, the postgraduate pricing system. And the relevant analysis, mainly from Will Croucher, has shown that some students are paying double the typical price charged in the Commonwealth-supported places. And the question of whether the university should be able to use this potent financial instrument where all the risk is taken by taxpayers, that's a pretty big ethical issue for me. Just as with international students, the universities, probably understandably, are using these revenues to pay for non-teaching activities. I had two further critical issues. One I've touched on, I just want to revisit. It is so important. If people want to enrol in a postgraduate course in an Australian institution and they have to find money to pay cash, what's the point of having a HECS system? The HECS system was all about not having that happen. So if future governments, or the current government, takes the conceptual basis of the system seriously and believes that it is sound and proper, this needs to be addressed. Now, I have got just a plethora, a kind of a wish list of things that I wish I had several more hours. Is that okay? Yes, thank you very much. I know you've got nothing to do. There's a few things that I've been thinking about that I think need mentioning, and I won't analyse them at all. The first one, I've been on about this for 36 years. Why is HECS only for university students? Tertiary students, that is vet students and TAFE students, they've got the same financing problem. They can't borrow from the bank. What happens now in the TAFE system is one of two things. It's either free, because the TAFEs, people who run TAFE don't want to stop people coming, or they charge upfront fees. Some have HECS, but almost none. We always had a very powerful case for the universality because the tertiary system outside of higher education is one which the market failures are just as real and just as important. I think TAFE's been damaged significantly over the last 25 years by not having a secure and fair and equitable loan system which could have meant a lot more people into this arrangement. What is this stuff about banks treating HECS debt as if it's normal debt, like it's a credit card debt? This is pretty weird stuff. The critical point about HECS is that if you haven't got it, haven't got the income, it doesn't matter, it gets deferred. So why do the banks treat that as a liability as if it's equivalent to a credit card debt? It is pretty ignorant stuff, but the government can do something very straightforward about this. APRA could be asked to require banks to treat HECS debt differently from other debts, or to make it really simple, to base the eligibility for a mortgage not on the level of debt, but your capacity to service the debt. That is, post-HECS, post-income, instead of the current levels of the current arrangements which take into account the stock. A levy could be used in conjunction with soft caps instead of the caps for international students. Rowan Pitchford, Rugby Talkie, has convinced me that this is a very good idea, and they've explained and promoted the idea. If there's caps, then the universities for international students will increase the prices. That's not a terrible thing, because the price elasticities are such that there won't be a big response. In other words, the revenue basis of the system will improve. Moreover, a levy arrangement will deliver a revenue stream. Now, people say, oh, but it's an immigration issue. Well, if it's an immigration issue related to housing, for example, for Sydney and Melbourne, it's not that hard to change the nature of the arrangement of a potential levy to take into account the geographic situation. I've just about finished, I think, regretfully for me, but possibly not for you. I think one other thing I'd like to talk about is that Cam Baldwin and Glenn Withers have talked about the idea of business partnerships using revenue contingent loan for business in partnership with research and development with Australian universities. The research and development basis of our policy is very poor at the moment. What they've come up with is a real live way of increasing the revenue in ways that will attract business, in my view, and get something going in that particular space. Thank you for your attention.
Bruce.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. I was just looking at people's faces and everyone was smiling, which is quite odd when an economist is speaking. But anyway, so I think one of the things we've got to is that HECS is no longer this single system of income contingent loans. There are so many carve-outs and very different things. So, you know, you talk about vocational loans for vocational systems. That was introduced for a hot moment in the mid-2010s, and it got rorted to all get out by providers, and that is about design of the system. I think one of the other things people don't understand, that if you don't go to a public university, you have to pay a 20% loan fee on top of your HECS, which is unfair. One of the other things someone spoke about earlier is that there used to be a 20% discount if you paid up front. The problem with all of this is complicating quite simple and direct policy. Can you just talk through how you kind of feel about some of these aspects? And I also am with you on Postgraduate, like it's just chaotic out there. So is there any hope of resolving some of these anomalies and inconsistencies?
Some of them can be fixed fairly easily, I think, and it's correct to say that we had a surcharge. When HECS was introduced, there was a surcharge for paying later. It's just that it took an unusual form. It was a discount for an upfront payment, and that's the same thing as paying more in nominal terms for paying later. There's a good reason for that, and that is there are interest rate subsidies which are very high for some students in some arrangements. So the idea of a surcharge is in part to cover the government cost of borrowing, and I've never thought that that was problematic. But mind you, I didn't think indexation was problematic until last year, when the politics of that was overwhelming, I think partly because we hadn't had much inflation for 20 years. And then suddenly, and also the indexation arrangements are not beautifully designed, once a year. So you're all right for 11 months and 30 days, and then boom, it went up by 7%. And so some people in politics were Chicken Little. I mean, the sky is falling. It was very kind of scary. Interest rate subsidies are very hard to understand. And so if you don't kind of get it and you're just frightened by it, which a lot of people might be, you can make this very fearful. And that's kind of what happened. But think of it like this. The government purchases a university place for a student. It costs, I'll just make it up, $15,000. Then the government waits for the $15,000 to come in. It'll come through very disparately, depending on the student's situation. And what that means is that if they just waited and there's no adjustment for inflation, in present value terms, in true price terms, they'd be getting a lot less back, maybe 30, 35%. So indexation was justified. And I also think that having the surcharge of 15 or 20% there's a case for that as well. It'd be nice to make it all consistent. You refer to what I call the vet debacle of about 2010. This was a consummate example of really poorly thought out policy. You say to a whole lot of providers, you've got this potent instrument, this HECS thing, you can go and get people enrolled into these courses, and don't worry if they don't graduate, don't worry if they don't even want to do it, but you could kind of bribe them if you want. And there are cases where people were given laptops. People in nursing homes were enrolling in these courses, and the private providers were just taking the money as it was. It's a classic case of the risks not being borne by the people supplying the instrument. And it's always been a big issue with HECS. And when some very unfriendly person said to me, it's all the fault of those people who designed HECS, it was really the fault of the legislators not understanding the potency of the instrument. I hope that never happens again. I also hope that the whole debate doesn't get thrown away because of that poor policy design. The case for having it in TAFE is really overwhelming.
Okay. Our first question is from Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
Thanks for your speech. It's a common rule for technocrats and economists not to get into the politics and have a go at politicians. You actually ventured there a bit. You talked about a political party. You dared not mention its name, but I will be bold. I'll say it was the Greens, and of course the Teals.
Who are they?
The Greens political party, as Labor calls them, and the Teals, well, some of the Teals. And then you talked about there's no such thing as free education. But the Greens and the Teals are banging away at free education, and it's a great electoral play. It plays to the selfishness of the students and their parents. So I'm going to invite you to venture back into the political fray and tell us how a politician could argue that free education shouldn't be happening.
I think if I was a politician, I'd kind of use the arguments I've used today. Why it's inequitable. The most important piece of public policy, regressivity. That means transferring resources to the least advantage and away from the most advantage is so-called free. As I said,
that wouldn't actually kind of cut it with the young students who were voting for the first time.
All right, let me take you back to 1988.
Okay.
And the reason that HECS was introduced in the first place, John Dawkins faced a huge problem, and that is when he became minister in 84, I think. But from 1983 to 1987, when he first started talking about the introduction of tuition, the school retention rates almost, they doubled. 35% of young people were finishing high school in 1982. By 1987, that number was 70%. So he had this huge queue problem. You had a whole lot of people who, according to their expectations and what had happened to their brother or sister, were qualified to go to university. They couldn't get in. And the only way that the system would accommodate them would be to make it much larger. And I might say the most important thing, if you care about poor people's access to higher education, is to have a big system. So Dawkins said continually and kept to this promise, all the money would be used for more places. That was his political problem, and that's what happened. When the guarantee, not the guarantee, but the promise of HECS revenue was clear from about 1988, 1989, the government of the day, in their first budget, increased the outlays by 16%. That was all about the politics of the queues. And every time John Dawkins had a chance, he said, we are doing this to help the people who can't get in without it. And I think that was not just sensible and accurate, but it was a way of talking to people about their self-interest. Hey, do you know somebody who got a really good ATAR last year but didn't make it in? They can make it this year because we've increased the outlays by 16%. I think that's the way to do it.
Okay.
Our next question is David Crowe from the SMH and Age.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you, Bruce, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. I would like to draw you out more on the pricing side of what you've been talking about there, because it's often seemed to me that one of the things about HECS is it kind of shields the customer from the upfront reality of the price, because that price is deferred over time. How do you see a different price system working if you were to move to this lifetime earnings idea about setting the price? Wouldn't that be an immense challenge for the universities, because they wouldn't be getting as much for the course they offered in the humanities, for instance? How do you see that working?
Well, the way it happens at universities now is that a student enrolling in a particular area, economics, psychology or whatever, the universities get that amount of money which is the student debt. The government doesn't get that amount of money because it's interest subsidised and have to wait for it to come in. But the government also has a top-up. Don't ask me what the top-up is all about, but it's the total combination that will determine if the universities are interested in this. I do not understand where the top-ups come from. So we can separate those things. It doesn't really, what the universities will care about financially is the total package. And that's why when the Jobs Ready Graduate Package came about, which doubled the prices for humanities, and some people said, oh, humanities will all be ruined. Brian Schmidt, the Vice-Chancellor, I was very impressed with him. The morning after I heard him on the radio, he said, we're going to have a lot more humanities students. It's fantastic. My director, Ravi Talkie, said, isn't this great for economics? The amount of money's gone up, and the government did not simultaneously cut the other part of it. So humanities got a big boost, so long as the students kept on coming. STEM, it did the opposite. So one of the major design flaws was not thinking about the supply response for the institutions. So that has to be worked through. I think the right way of doing it is the government should provide what is the equivalent of the teaching costs, some estimate of the teaching costs per place, separate it from research, deal with research more explicitly, don't confuse us all with this thing called the government top-up, which nobody understands, and to make the universities make decisions on the teaching costs and then to have research separate from that. So in the way it would work, when you fix up that kind of fuzziness and complication, it's all straightforward. So Tim and Gurav's work, they've got 4 groups of expected lifetime income. So humanities, teaching, nursing at the bottom, medical specialists, law, dentistry, they're at the top, and then the STEM courses and others in the middle. It's pretty easy to follow. It's not that different from what we've got now. What they've done, though, is to make the decisions and the choice of options to reflect the expectations of lifetime income. No one's ever done that properly. As I said, in 1998 they got pretty close. But that's a really good basis in which to start. And while it sounds kind of complicated, what really then matters is the extent of the subsidies. And what Tim and Gurav have done, you've worked out that humanities, for example, per dollar debt, the subsidies are greater because they pay back slower. Law, it's the other way around. So the budget complications will be determined in part by the expected outcome of the graduate, and those subsidies can be calculated. That's what they've done. It's not that hard.
Thanks.
Can I just come back to you on that? So there's a lot of problems with job-ready graduates, and one of the things is that it did not actually change demand from a student point of view because there is no elasticity. Students don't think about the debt before they do it, so it hasn't changed actual student demand at all, like it's like a small percentage point or something like that. The other thing is that there's a real equity issue to this in that cluster 1 where the cluster 1 students pay, so this is arts, humanities, economics, philosophy, those sorts of things. The students pay over $16,000 and the government contributes $12,000, but 41% of all students are in that cluster 1. And of those, the majority are low socioeconomic background, from disadvantaged backgrounds, and the majority of Indigenous students are in those clusters. So we have, sorry, I'm making a statement, not a question, I think, but there's a real moral dimension to this too, isn't there?
Well, I think so, but I'd put it in economic terms. It is regressive. Within the cohort of graduates, having humanities students per year of study paying much more than medical graduates, Tell me the justification for that. The justification, as the Minister put it at the time, was to change people's choices. This is really weird. Ask yourself about your own career. Would you have changed what you've done if the price change was such that it took away 2% of your lifetime income and it was all presented with a default protected income contingent loan system? The way I put it is, if you've always loved pussycats, you want to be a vet. And if they make being a vet a bit more expensive, you don't suddenly say, oh, I'll be a chartered accountant. Or I didn't want really to be a nurse and look after people who are really sick. I want to be a civil engineer. So the idea that there's going to be a price response, this is about people's characters and their personalities, their aspirations, and their capacities and interests. It was never going to work. And the other point is, and this is a point that Gaurav and I looked at, the price ain't what it looks like. So if you double the humanities price from whatever it went from 8,000 to 16,000, think about what this means for the humanities student or the prospective humanities student. So I'm 18, I'm going to study for 3 or 4 years, and then I'm going to get a job. I won't hit the first threshold for a while, and then this affects my life in about 12 years' time, because it's going to add about 2 years to my debt repayment. It doesn't affect how much you pay in any period. It affects the total, and the mechanism operates through how long you pay. So you're saying to the 18-year-old, something terrible is going to happen to you when you're 33. You're going to have to pay for 1.5 more years just because you want to do this humanities stuff. How many people will respond to that? The answer was, as you said, nobody. It was just very poorly judged. And sometimes I wonder if the rhetoric was not false, because it just seemed to me to be so strange that it was not understood. And there was an aspect of the Jobs Ready graduate package which makes more sense to me, kind of a bit cynical. The government saved money. All the package put together meant about $1 billion worth of savings. But to dress it up in terms of labour market choice, when we know that the responsiveness to the price and the elasticities were close to nothing inherently, because what people want to do is what people want to do. If you had upfront fees, I think it would change, but we don't.
Okay. Our next question is Nicola Smith from the Nightly.
Professor Chapman, thanks very much for taking our questions. My question is on international students, which you mentioned briefly. And there have been a number of politicians who've been linking the influx of international students to the housing crisis, leading to fears that international students could be scapegoated during the election campaign and simply not come to Australia. I'd like to know your view on how real are those fears, and what could be the potential economic impact on the higher education system?
Thank you for the question. I wish I had an answer. I know very little about immigration. I know what this debate looks like as an outsider. I do think the caps are a very blunt instrument. It's not clear that they will go ahead, but I'll refer you to the work that came from Rowan Pitchford and Rabi Toki. There's a better way of doing things. Economists hate quantity restrictions. They can't add to efficiency, but you can actually, there's an economic case for a levy, and let me make that case. The economic case is the following. Australian universities, some for well over 100 years, have been hugely subsidised in terms of research money, which has built up their reputations. So the reason that they have political and economic power internationally is because of the subsidies. And on top of that, they're rent-free. So the properties at the University of Sydney, Adelaide, University of Western Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, they're getting huge public sector subsidies. And the case for the levy is in part about the equity of getting a return for taxpayers. I wish I could say more about the immigration issues. I've occasionally made off-the-cuff comments which were so misinformed and dumb that I regretted it for months and months and months, so I can't do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from John Ross via Morris Riley.
John sends his apologies. Bruce, he's in Laos. John's the Asia Pacific editor of Times Higher Education. His question is, the main argument against free university tuition is that it is regressive. Universities disproportionately admit people from wealthy backgrounds. So if degrees are free, you end up with disadvantaged taxpayers subsidising the rich. But there are counter-arguments to that proposition, especially that university graduates end up squaring the ledger by paying a lot of tax in the future. There's a sense that student debt is now becoming a real disincentive to study amid the furore around high indexation and expensive art degrees. Is it time to revisit the whole argument around free tuition?
No. I could say a little bit more about that. The case for charging is an equity case. We can't make an economic efficiency case, and the reason is this is not kind of a clearing market. So economists are very keen about economic efficiency, getting the prices right, getting the subsidies or the taxes right. You can't take that model and apply it very simply to this kind of modelling, but the equity case is what drives it, and I think that is just as sound. And it was profoundly important in the decision of that cabinet. And the two people who pushed this the strongest, Peter Walsh, remember him, the finance minister, and John Dawkins, they never stopped complaining about, they called it middle class welfare. I don't like the term, but you know where they're coming from. And the so-called free was always easy to portray accurately as unfair. And I've heard politicians in many countries arguing the case for a charge, and they kind of cheat by picking on lawyers. How would you like it if the multi-millionaire corporate lawyer is financed by the checkout person from Woolies? That's what happens with a free situation. I think the point is really very clear. But what's strange to me even now is the romance and the sentiment that is still held for the abolition of fees in 1974. I was a great fan of Gough Whitlam, and some of the things that happened in that period were extraordinary. But abolishing fees just didn't matter empirically, and there were several reasons. Number one, the poor children had left high school well before they would go to university. They were leaving at age 14 or 15, take apprenticeships or unskilled work. That's the first point. And the second point is that just about everyone had a scholarship. So if you were from that era, you probably had a Commonwealth scholarship, or ask your parents if they had a Commonwealth scholarship. In fact, we had a weird event in John Dawkins' office because he was very bothered about the sentiment and affection for Gough Whitlam on fee abolition. And a senior public servant said, "Don't worry about this stuff, Minister," she said. "Nobody paid fees. They all got scholarships. So the only people who paid fees were the rich, dumb ones." And I thought that was a fairly risky thing to say. And there was silence in the office, and John Dawkins kind of looked a bit embarrassed, and he shuffled his pencil a bit, and he said, "Well, I paid fees." And Vince Fitzgerald, the secretary of his department, who was kind of dux of the entire world, he quickly, as Sir Humphrey would have done, said in 0.003 of a second, "I paid fees too, Minister." But we knew it wasn't true. How unlucky could she be? She picked out the only two people in the country to pay fees and say that they were rich and dumb.
Julie, on indulgence, second question. What incentives could there be for business to help pay employees after they've graduated some of their HECS fees, like removal of FBT?
They could do that. The economics of this is pretty tricky, and the reason is that labour is mobile. So if you want to pay what's called general human capital charges, you've got to cope as a company with the possibility that the labour that you're subsidising will leave. And so when you've got transferable skills, like a university degree, it's a very hard ask to expect employers to be interested in subsidising it. That's always been the problem. It's kind of an attractive thing, and people were saying it at the time that HECS was being introduced. Let business pay, let the companies pay, but it kind of is a fair way away from basic labour market theory, which is that the employers need people to stay with them to get the return on investment, and organising that system without massive amounts of legislation seems to me to be almost impossible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our final question is from Nick Stewart.
Oh, thank you very much. I remember meeting you when you were putting this together on a quiet Canberra street, and you seemed like an extremely nice, quiet person.
You're so sweet.
And then I now realise you were putting a bomb together. And
It wasn't that bad.
But what you've done, you've exposed, I suppose, 3 years of government inaction from the current government, because you've said that they have done nothing about their earlier suggestions that they might revamp the arts education, and you've made the point that the charges, and you've made the point that there is a real need to do that. But the other thing that you mentioned was the need to actually integrate all elements of higher education, both the TAFE system, the university system, and the postgrad system. Do you think that what we really require is, dare one say, a new program to look at an entire education system that will actually transform the Australia in the years to come in the same way as HECS has done?
I don't think that changes have to be that radical. I mean, the area of great problem for me is tertiary education outside of universities. It's VET and TAFE. That could have been addressed by any government over the last 35 years. One of the complications is that the states and the territories control TAFE. So there's a political issue there. But when Julia Gillard was Minister for Education a very long time ago, she worked with the Victorian government to start the process to have universality of tertiary education in Victoria. And it started well, and it was going fine. I thought it was a great step. You don't need radical institutional change, you just need the availability. And the states can still have, and the territories can have any discretion they want. Scholarships if they want, they can set the prices. You need the Commonwealth government because they've got the collection mechanism. They own the tax office. But that's not a big deal. In public sector administrative terms, allowing the collection would be very straightforward. So I don't think it needs anything radical. On the way you portrayed what I talked about in terms of government inaction, I don't think I said that. But I don't know what the background story is. I do know that when I hear the Minister talk about the need for change, it's always been in the context of the new planned institution. And let me assure you, without defending the government, this modelling and the relative prices, it's hard stuff. You've got the two best people in the country there. They've been working on it for months. And even the Australian government actuary may not necessarily have all the relevant information. For example, the returns or the lifetime incomes by discipline of study. This is a hard ask. So I think it would be a cheap shot to say, oh, they haven't done anything and that's terrible. It's going to be expensive. There are ways around that. But I'm hoping, and I don't know the answer, that one of the first things that the Tertiary Education Commission does is to look at this very, very appropriately and rigorously and kind of quickly.
Okay, I am going to present Professor Chapman with a gold membership to the National Press Club, and please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.